Well, I would like to start off by thanking the Mal, the collective, for inviting me here again. It's 10 years since I was here, and I was the British advisor for the exhibition when the exhibition was being put together. And tonight, I've been asked to talk about the British perspective, and I think we know a great deal, I think, about the German perspective on Gomorrah, but what I want to talk about today is a very British perspective. And I've called it How to Kill a City, which is indeed a frightful title. But that's exactly what the British set out to do during the course of the Second World War. I will explain in a moment how they tried. Excuse me. A great deal, a great deal has been written on Operation Gomorrah, the week-long night bombing of Hamburg between the 24th and 25th of July and the 2nd and 3rd of August 1943, and I'm not going to repeat very much about the operation itself. For RAF Bomber Command, the operation was regarded as the high point of the bombing war, achieving a level of destruction and death only matched in the bombing of Dresden in February 1945, when German defeat was already certain. But there has been much less interest in the evolution of discourses in Britain on the purposes and limits of bombing strategy among the wider civilian public and the military and political leadership. And I want to talk this evening about how those discourses changed between the pre-war view of bombing and the eventual strategy that permitted deliberate annihilation of civilian workers and their civilian milieu. This broader explanatory context makes it possible to understand how the operation was justified, even celebrated, by those who conducted the bombing, by the specialists who advised on its conduct, and by the wider public who endorsed it. I want to start in the 1930s. Fear of bombing and revulsion against its indiscriminate nature was widespread in Britain in the 1930s. Popular writing highlighted the probable effects of a mass bombing attack on a major city, and it did so with the exaggeration of science fiction. Nothing helped to sustain these anxieties more than the news of the bombing of the Basque city of Guernica in April 1937 by a combined force of German and Italian aircraft. The raid was widely publicized as an atrocity against defenseless civilians, and particular attention was paid to the German use of incendiaries, which were responsible for most of the destruction. The incendiary would later become the principal weapon of RAF Bomber Command, but in 1937 it was regarded as an unacceptable weapon of mass destruction. Bombing with incendiaries was condemned in Britain as pure terror bombing, typical of the ruthless character of fascist warfare. In March 1938, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, publicly condemned the bombing as a violation of international law. Nor did the RAF regard incendiaries as a weapon worth using in modern warfare. Not from any moral scruples, but because they regarded the high explosive bomb as the only effective means of delivering destruction against enemy military and military economic targets. The only incendiary device the RAF employed was a small fire razor weighing only a few grams, which was used in the colonies in the Middle East to drop on villagers and their inflammable huts in order to crush local rebellion. A larger 1.8 kilo incendiary device was developed in 1936 at RAF request but it was regarded as a subsidiary weapon, perhaps for use against enemy crops, but not for operations against military and industrial targets. When bombing operations against Germany eventually began in May 1940, British aircraft carried a few or no incendiary bombs, and little effort was made to expand their production, though eventually 76 million of them were produced during the course of the war. With the coming of war, the RAF was faced with severe restrictions on bombing strategy, but stemmed from the political rejection of any operations that might involve civilian casualties. In August 1939, the Air Ministry instructed Bomber Command to hit only identifiable military targets without negligent harm to civilians. Bombing through cloud or at night when the target could not be properly identified was illegal under the existing laws of war. So too was any bombing in which civilians might be killed or hospitals and cultural monuments destroyed. An interdepartmental committee set up by Chamberlain concluded in October 1939, and I quote, that it is clearly illegal to bombard a populated area in the hope of hitting a legitimate target. The definition of illegality stemmed from the so-called Hague Rules of Air Warfare, drawn up by a committee of jurists at the request of the League of Nations in 1923, from which the British government derived its own restrictions. Although not having the full force of international law, the Hague Rules were treated by the British government as if they had. Protection of civilians from bombardment was also consistent with the Hague Conventions drawn up before the First World War. Although these limitations too were ignored in practice in German and British bombing carried out in 1917-1918. The critical question for me for understanding the campaign that led to the firebombing of Hamburg is why the British government and the leadership of the RAF not only overturned the initial limitations on unrestricted bombing, but also came to endorse a strategy that targeted civilians deliberately. Now, this was a slow, step-by-step process, but the result was to eliminate whatever moral scruples might have inhibited a liberal state from conducting war against civilians. The first step was taken by Winston Churchill's new government in May 1940, shortly after the beginning of the German invasion in the West, when the decision had to be taken whether raids on urban targets in Germany by night could be undertaken in the hope that the raids might draw the Luftwaffe back from France. When it came to the risk of inflicting civilian casualties, Churchill argued that there was no longer any need to abide by the laws of war because of the atrocious way the war in Poland had been waged by the Germans. Long before the Luftwaffe undertook the bombing campaign against Britain in September 1940, RAF Bomber Command raided designated industrial and military targets in Western Germany on every night it was possible to do so. And it's important to recall this. We often forget that the British began the bombing war in cities between Britain and Germany in 1940. The raids achieved little, but they did result in killing or injuring civilians, a result that freed Hitler too to retaliate in kind later in the autumn. Over the summer and autumn of 1940, the legal limitations that had been imposed in 1939 were gradually set aside, although there was no formal directive yet to target civilians. The major change in British views of bombing came in the winter and spring of 1941 after assessing the results of months of German bombing of British ports and industrial cities. Examination of the effect of German air raids persuaded the Air Ministry to abandon the futile attempt to hit precise targets in Germany, and instead to hit civilian working-class residential areas in order to cause maximum death and destruction. In this way, it was argued, many factories would be affected simultaneously by the death or absence of their workers, rather than just one factory. The argument was strongly supported by the British Ministry of Economic Warfare as a way of maximising the damage to the German war economy. An Air Ministry paper in April 1941 summed up the new strategy, and I quote, "Carefully planned and continuous blitz attacks delivered on the centre of the working class area of the German cities and towns is undoubtedly the most effective weapon available to our bomber force. It is felt the aiming point of the first aircraft over the target should be the centre of the working class area and not the centre of the industrial zone." In July 1941, the first directive intended to target civilians was published. But to avoid any accusation that the RAF was deliberately attacking civilians, the directive used the veiled language of working class morale to mask a strategy in which morale was actually to be undermined by the death and injury of workers and their families and the destruction of their housing. In January 1942, the Air Ministry Bombing Directorate prepared to draft a new directive for Bomber Command, in which it was explained that, and I quote again, "The attacks against industrial areas should be concentrated primarily on the civilian population." In February 1942, the so-called Area Bombing Directive was finally issued with the principal target the morale of the civil population and in particular of the industrial workers. Now, a second lesson was learned from the Blitz, which would dominate the evolution of British bombing strategy for the rest of the war. All the reports from bombed areas in Britain, supplied by the fire and police authorities, confirmed that up to 90% of the destruction was the result of incendiary bombing rather than high explosives. German aircraft regularly carried up to 2/3 of their bomb load as incendiaries. The Air Ministry reversed the view of the 1930s, making the incendiary bomb the main weapon and high explosive bombs secondary and supplementary, as they called it. Useful for blowing out windows to help spread the fire, and useful to terrorise the civil defence services. Now, this decision produced a temporary crisis, as there was far too little magnesium to expand output of incendiaries rapidly. Churchill understood that this would reduce what he called the scale of fire-raising attacks, which he approved, and successfully threw his considerable political weight behind the effort to obtain more magnesium imports from the United States. The shift to targeting civilians also depended on developing new operational tactics for incendiary bombing, and eventually made an operation like Gomorrah possible. The tactical changes included a target marking force to indicate the city centre, bomb point, the introduction of the bomber's stream, a continuous stream, to ensure a continuous rain of incendiaries, and improved navigation aids so that the right city could be found, a problem for much of the early stages of the bombing campaign. Success also depended on understanding the geography of German cities to see where the greatest impact could be made. The Air Ministry elaborated a zoning system for German cities, in which the priority was bombing was Zone 1, central city area fully built up, as it was defined, and Zone 2A, compact residential area fully built up. Zone 4 was the industrial area, no longer a priority for Bomber Command, since factory sites were much more difficult to burn down. And we should observe, in fact, that the factory district was the safest place to be in Hamburg on the night of the fire. firestorm. Even with these innovations, the Air Ministry needed to comprehend the best way to burn a city down. Cities were a large target, geographically spread out, built generally of materials difficult to set alight, and with roads and parks that separated one residential quarter from another. What the ministry wanted was to create a major conflagration, and for this they needed the help of scientists and engineers. The study of the effect of fire on British cities was now applied to German cities. At the Building Research Station and the Road Research Laboratory, experiments were set up to evaluate the impact of different kinds of incendiary on German houses and apartments. Models of German housing were constructed using advice from German architects in exile, including Walter Gropius, the Bauhaus architect. By October 1941, the researchers concluded, and I quote, that the German house will burn well. It was understood that wind speed and direction were important in multiplying the effect of fire, as was later evident in Hamburg. And at the Scientific Research Centre at Porton Down, models of German urban areas were constructed to calculate the typical spread of a fire. There was much more prospect of a conflagration where the residential area was tightly packed, particularly with older housing. The bombing directorate concluded that setting fire, and I quote, to the terraces of box-like buildings dating from the Middle Ages would yield a good dividend. In all of this research, the object was to cause maximum damage to civilians and civilian housing. Now, to further the research on fire raising, the Air Ministry invited a number of senior scientists and technologists to create an informal committee on the tactics of incendiary attacks. The first meeting was held in the senior common room for academic staff at Imperial College London, the Science College in London, in November 1942, and continued until the end of the war in Europe, when the committee turned to discussing the burning down of Japanese cities. In April 1944, the committee was formally instituted as the Incendiary Panel. Among its members were two prominent pacifists, J.D. Bernal and Jacob Bronowski, who found no moral objection to researching how to destroy an enemy city by fire, a paradox that Bernal confronted after the war by eliminating from his personal archive all the documentation relating to his wartime work. In a meeting in September 1942, it was Bernal, the pacifist, who wanted to research the incendiary load necessary to render a city incapable, as he called it, of coping with fire. It was Bernal who argued that incendiaries must be able to penetrate to the living areas of German workers, where the potential damage was much greater. The scientific group spent much of the time arguing over the density of incendiaries necessary to create what was called for the first time in August 1942 a firestorm. In May 1943, in other words a couple of months before Gomorrah, asked by the Air Ministry to discuss fire raising, the committee concluded that wind velocity and airflow characteristics were important criteria. If there was turbulent air sucked into the fire zone from outside, then a major uncontrollable conflagration would result. And Hamburg, 3 months later, demonstrated that the scientists were entirely right. Now we might ask, how is it possible for civilian experts to accept their role in advising on the destruction of an urban area by fire, or herbicide, as it comes to be called today? None of those working on the issue of fire raising could have been in any doubt about the purpose of their work. Indeed, one of the scientists directly attached to Bomber Command, Basil Dickens, regretted a few months after Gomorrah that the RAF could not produce an all-consuming holocaust, as he called it, every time a German city was bombed. In the minutes of the incendiary panel discussions, there is not a single mention of any ethical objection to work they were engaged on. At this point, perhaps, the work of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman or Eric Marcuson on the possibility of extreme violence in the context of modernity is helpful in diagnosing the way modern institutions can contribute to violent outcomes without moral qualms. They emphasize first the fragmentation of responsibility, which allows experts and officials to work on just one part of the process that results in killing, without seeing the reality of inflicting mass death. Sitting in the common room in Imperial College, the scientists concentrated on the technical issues they were asked to respond to, rather than questioning the value of the strategy or its ethical implications. Second, according to Bauman and Marcuson, is the importance of psychological distance from the effects of research. None of us ever saw the people we killed, wrote Freeman Dyson, a young scientist working for Bomber Command. None of us particularly cared. Research carried out in the domestic context of scientific inquiry was entirely remote from the visceral experience of young pilots who had to fly into the German defensive zone to drop the quantity of incendiaries recommended by the experts. The scientists and engineers found their own way of justifying their work. Unfortunately, it turns out that we are bombing cities indiscriminately, wrote Dyson, but this is morally acceptable, as it is helping to win the war. Distance was underlined by the use of euphemistic language to suggest that the intended targets were geographical or architectural features rather than human beings and the houses they lived in. One example was the use of the term de-housing, coined by Churchill's personal scientific advisor, Friedrich Lindemann, which suggested a clinical procedure rather than the traumatic consequences of death, injury, and homelessness. The public discourse on bombing, on the other hand, was more circumspect. The RAF wanted to avoid any accusation that they conducted terror bombing, which in effect attacks on morale were, and instead maintained the fiction that bombing was always directed at military and war industry targets. The Air Ministry insisted on using abstract language when discussing bombing to mask the reality. When the words centres of population slipped into a document in 1942, the words were hastily changed to industrial centres to sustain the abstract character of the target. The very term morale was sufficiently imprecise to mask exactly what was intended in burning down city centres. Now, this sophistry proved too much for the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, who a few months after Gomorrah tried to get the Air Ministry to publish openly the intention of the bombing was, and I quote, the killing of German workers and the destruction of civilized community life. But the Air Ministry refused on the grounds that the directive for area bombing did not specify war on civilians, but only on morale, a distinction necessary, it was claimed, to religious and humanitarian opinion from criticising what the RAF was actually doing. Throughout the period of incendiary bombing of cities, every effort was made to render invisible the urban populations who were the actual target. Even some of those working in the Air Ministry or the RAF failed to grasp the true nature of bombing strategy, preferring to accept the mendacious claim that civilian residential areas were not a deliberate objective. For the wider public, the switch in strategy in 1941 was not immediately evident. The limited information provided to the press and radio by the Air Ministry Publicity Department regularly repeated throughout the war the claim that only important military industrial targets had been hit. The Air Ministry was keen to show that British bombing was not for vengeance, but was a carefully calculated strategy of industrial destruction. For the public too, the calls for vengeance during the Blitz were far from universal. Opinion polls found the public equally divided on the question of whether German civilians should be bombed. And in London, the most heavily bombed city of Britain, only 45% favoured retaliation. The public widely accepted that British bombing was for military purposes. But as British bombing escalated in scale, public interest waned. The campaign was a long war of attrition, with few key moments, and the reports on raids all followed a predictable pattern. The public discourse was also muted because for much of the period of RAF heavy bombing, there was much more popular interest in the ground war or the war at sea, and from 1941 onwards, the war on the Eastern Front, which attracted a sustained level of enthusiasm. The extent to which the Air Ministry sought to shield its strategy from the public view was exemplified by an exchange between William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury and head of the Anglican Church, and Archibald Sinclair, the British Air Minister, a week before Gomorrah. Temple claimed that he received many letters from Christians anxious to know that the RAF had not changed its strategy from bombing military targets to bombing civilians and then go. The minister instructed the publicity department to draft a reply that only legitimate military economic targets were aimed at, because they produced weapons that would otherwise kill, in his words, British husbands, brothers and sons. 4 days before the firestorm in Hamburg, Temple thanked the Air Ministry for its reassurance, which he would pass on to his Christian correspondents. In private, the publicity department prepared a brief for the minister, confirming that the RAF was indeed targeting and killing civilians, but for the moral purpose of defeating Germany and securing, in their words, the freedom of mankind. Only a few months before, the RAF Chief of Staff, Charles Portal, had spelled out for his fellow chiefs the ambition for the future bombing campaign, which was to kill 900,000 Germans and to injure another 1 million. An aim, I think, that in other contexts might well be regarded as genocidal. The parallel discourses, one private, one public, determined Hamburg's fate in 1943, while at the same time it stifled any significant criticism of bombing strategy. The context for Gomorrah goes back to the turning point in RAF strategy, completely remote from the attitude towards bombing in the 1930s, and justified in morally relative terms as a strategy necessary for winning the war. Now, Hamburg had featured in Air Ministry planning for incendiary attack long before Gomorrah. The bombing directorate in the ministry suggested in November 1941 that Hamburg would be the ideal target for the new firebombing campaign, with the centre point, and I quote, the congested city and housing areas north of the Elbe. The plan eventually followed in 1943. A further study in February 1942 had Hamburg at the top of the list of vulnerable targets. Harris, when he became head of Bomber Command in February 1942, wanted to obliterate the city by an inextinguishable complication, as he called it. And he hoped to target Hamburg in late May 1942 in the first 1,000 bomber raid, but was frustrated by poor weather. By summer 1943, Hamburg had been subject to 137 small raids, but the Air Ministry now rated the city as the #1 priority, and Harris prepared Operation Gomorrah to meet that priority. If the major raids had taken place in May 1942 and not July 1943, Hamburg would not have suffered the firestorm. But under the right conditions, limited opposition, favourable weather, and a heavy concentration of incendiaries, it was now possible to achieve the conflagration that Harris and his scientific advisors looked for. For Harris, the week of raids on Hamburg vindicated the new strategy. He told the Anglo-American Combined Chiefs of Staff meeting in Quebec a week after the end of Gomorrah that he was certain, and I quote, we can push Germany over by bombing this year. There was no possibility of certainty, with poor or little intelligence on German conditions. But Harris relied instead on a measurement of effect that he began in 1942, counting the number of urban acres or hectares destroyed in residential zones 1 and 2A. Well, by December 1942, they'd been able to devastate only 3% of the urban area. But following Gomorrah, the figure was 20,000 acres destroyed, or 25% of the inner urban area of the major German cities. An achievement that Harris used to justify yet further fire-raising. The use of the urban area as a unit of measurement was another convenient abstraction that distanced the strategy from the fact of killing Germans. Although few people who saw the statistics and the photographs of bombed apartment blocks could really have doubted that the victims were ordinary civilians. In 1943, the RAF dropped 29 million incendiary bombs on German city centres. Now, it has often been assumed that there was no counter-discourse in Britain in reaction to the bombing campaign, but this is a misleading claim. There certainly was a fraction of the British public that did understand what the statistics and images indicated. They mobilised protest over the bombing campaign, much along the lines of popular British protests about bombing in the Spanish Civil War or the Sino-Japanese War of the 1930s. A group of secular and Christian pacifists established the Committee for the Abolition of Night Bombing in August 1941, including the well-known pacifist writer Vera Brittain and the economist Stanley Jevons, who became the chair of the committee. They organised a petition against night bombing, which was regarded as more likely to maximise civilian casualties, and not against day bombing. And by spring 1942, almost 15,000 people had signed it, despite the hostility of the government and the close watch by the British Security Service, MI5. But most of the senior churchmen and politicians that the committee tried to recruit to their cause responded in terms that echoed the formal government position. The moderator of the Church of Scotland, for example, replied that he accepted the statements that only military, industrial and transport targets were aimed for. Lord David Davis, who had campaigned in the 1930s to abolish the bomber aircraft, replied to the committee that in his view, and I quote, "The more Germans that are killed, the sooner will this horrible war be over." Most of those who responded were quite prepared to adopt the official line rather than risk challenging the war effort. In late summer 1942, the committee was refounded under the title the Bombing Restriction Committee, dedicated to publishing pamphlets and books to show the public that British bombing was now illegally directed at mass city and civilian targets. Small though the number of activists was, there were many more Christians of all denominations who disliked the bombing policy and protested it through numerous letters to church leaders or to the government. The bombing of Hamburg was a key moment for the movement. Drawing on reports in neutral press in Switzerland and Sweden, the committee published What Happened in Hamburg, outlining the nature of the firestorm and its grim consequences for the population unable to escape it. But several prominent scientists publicly dismissed the idea of a firestorm as an intrinsic absurdity, as they said. But it was precisely what the scientific advisors of the Air Ministry had been hoping to create, not once, but every time the RAF bombed a city centre. Now, the committee was allowed to continue its campaign despite police surveillance, because the government assumed its impact was slight. But the dissenting voice represented a wider constituency than the committee members. There was a consistent private discourse against civilian bombing that ran from the 1930s through the protests of the wartime years and on to the anti-nuclear protests of the 1950s. There was also skepticism among political and military leaders about whether bombing was an efficient use of resources, although there was no ethical concern. Churchill had no objection to the bombing of Hamburg. Indeed, when the government scientific advisor Henry Tizard tried to persuade him against Gomorrah in July 1943, Churchill dismissed his intervention. But Churchill, too, was simply not persuaded that the great claims made for bombing by the Air Ministry were really justified. The Army and Navy Chiefs of Staff were also unconvinced that bombing would deliver what was promised, and when necessary, diverted the bombing to tactical purposes in the Battle of the Atlantic or in the invasion of France. There was no certain way that Bomber Command could demonstrate the effects on German production or morale, which is why the fire-raising strategy was maintained, because it provided strong visual evidence of urban destruction. Now, the bombing of Hamburg served one further purpose for the British Armed Forces. In the late 1950s, the Chiefs of Staff set up a committee with the acronym JIGSAW, Joint Intelligence Group for the Study of Air Warfare, to study the best way, and this was their brief, the best way to kill a city using nuclear weapons. The wartime destruction of Hamburg was the example chosen to illustrate what was possible. It was calculated that Hamburg was hit with the equivalent of a 5 kilotons nuclear strike, but not brought completely to a standstill. Modern nuclear weapons, it was argued, could kill Hamburg as a working city more effectively than had Bomber Command. But it was regarded as the best result that the RAF had achieved with the older technology. The Jigsaw Committee now wanted to measure effect, not in area destroyed, as Harris had, but in people killed. Soviet Cold War targets were to be chosen by considering, and I quote, only the effects on population, as had indeed been the reality in 1943. Here, once again, ruthless scientific calculation took precedence over any ethical concerns about loss of life. The decisions that led to the destruction in Hamburg and the death of over 34,000 people provide a significant example of the way in which wartime imperatives can undermine initial ethical concerns about the way warfare is conducted. No one in early 1940 would have imagined that the British Air Force would target civilians and their milieu as a deliberate strategy. The move towards greater levels of violence was governed by the perception of the enemy as dangerously evil, by changes in the available technology, and through the ability to mask a strategy of ruthlessness with misleading language and distorted information. Liberal states, I would argue, have no immunity from the degeneration of wartime practices, as American involvement in Korea and Vietnam have shown. The longer a war goes on, and the more difficult it is to find a path to victory, the more likely the resort to strategies of radical violence. And Gomorrah was just such a case. Thank you.